Good morning, good morning. Man, do I have an awesome topic for you guys today. Again, you guys continue to produce some pretty awesome comments, and I'm trying this thing out of just when I've got the particular muse and while I've got the mania, putting some stuff down on record. It's not too terribly difficult, and so we're rocking. So I got my extra chunky size booty out of bed this morning. Got my 2-mile run in. Had some phenomenally delicious low-calorie green beans and a glass of tea, and now here I sit talking into this damn microphone. It's a hell of a life, boys. But there was a question that came through the other day talking about power hammers, and I thought this would be a great topic to go over because power hammers really are they are the thing. For you guys out there, if you were happy with your 2-pound ball peen hammer, the only reason you're happy with it is because you have never had a power hammer because the power hammers are the key to really top-end work for the individual smith. Just hands down. No doubt, no question. So what I wanted to do real quick is and I don't think I've ever heard anybody really go over this in any sort of detail, and I'm not going to get too far in the weeds, but I wanted to give you you guys and girls out there, there's a few of you out there, a brief history of power hammers. And then if I've got a little bit of time, if I hadn't run my mouth too long, we'll talk about the things that you might be looking for if you're interested in a hammer. So, now of course there's going to be a lot more details, especially when it comes to what's happening across the pond over in Europe. But for today, I'm focusing solely on what's going on in the U.S. history of the power hammers to give you guys kind of that deal. So, of course, the majority of the power hammer history is going to start in Europe, and that's going to be with our tilt hammers. And again, we have at least some references to tilt hammers almost 1,000 years before Christ. I think it's right around the time of Christ that we actually have some really hardcore descriptions of the contraption itself. Previously, it's discussed, but we can't really tell if they were just kind of, coming up with some ideas or if they were actually describing the thing. But right around the time of Christ in China, we do have very accurate descriptions of what's going on with the thing. And you got to understand, these hammers were not just being used for steel. Imagine the number of things that we have to crush. I mean, the entire history of humanity has been get stick, hit something with it. And this is just an extension of that particular principle. So, for a lot of times, I think moving through the Middle Ages or even the early Middle Ages, you had the Romans. From what I understand, the Romans had several mills that were based on this tilt hammer style that were actually used to crush grain. And there was a really cool little article that talked about all these stones that basically have these large holes worn into them because these stones, these large blocks of a granite, were the anvil that you would put the grain on top of, and the tilt hammer would basically beat the grain, and after so many years it would wear a hole too deep into the stone, so they'd have to throw the stone away and get a new one, and apparently there's a lot of those stones left over there. So, but for us, this really comes into itself, when we're talking about iron and steel. These tilt hammers are used for many different things in society, and everything's relatively quiet from the time of Christ up until the Industrial Revolution in the 1840s. And I cannot stress to you the light speed turbo change that occurred with the Industrial Revolution. And again, going back over to Europe, there's a little bit of controversy on exactly who developed the first steam hammer. There was a gentleman in England who was very good at self-promoting, and there's a chance that he actually, I don't know if he stole the idea, but he was much better at publicizing himself, and I think that made him run awry of a Frenchman that claimed that he invented the steam hammer, but at this point, who knows? What we do know is around the 1840s, the steam hammer idea came to fruition because what was happening is that society was becoming it wasn't necessarily that the technology was advancing and society was following. There were people out there, people were having babies, more stuff was needed, the demand was growing, and the industry was trying to catch up. And these hammers were a direct result of industry trying to be able just to keep pace with the demand of the goods that were already there. There wasn't, now steam, of course, was this big technology, but it really was trying to help industry keep pace with the demand that was coming from the civilian side of things. Now, steam hammers, we're gonna there's gonna be a lot of threads in here. So let's start with what a steam hammer is. So essentially, a steam hammer is what we would know today as a utility hammer. It is simply a piston that drives a large hammerhead. Now, back in the day, these hammers, it's not like we know, because these hammers were monsters. Steam hammers, by the turn of 1900, the hammerhead weights started at 500 and went up to 50,000 pounds. In fact, if my research is correct, at Bethlehem Steel, by 1900, they had a hammer that could deliver a 125-ton hit. Holy monkey, that is 250,000 pounds of force on that end. Now, I don't know what size the actual hammerhead was, but apparently the actual striking weight was a 125-ton blow. That is just insanity. And these, of course, were powered by that steam, which steam is an incredible deal. Now, when things really start getting interesting, it's going to be 1900, and this is coming into the full-blown might of the American Industrial Revolution. And so now you see the steam hammers have been in these giant factories, and now you see that process we call miniaturization, because there's blacksmith shops everywhere, again, trying to keep up with the demand of this budding country, of this huge surge in all these babies being born, and things have to be produced. And that's when, and again, I have not done as much research on this as possible, but let's just say that there were several companies that came up with what we now know as the mechanical power hammer. This is going to be your Meyer Brothers, Little Giant, which I think technically is Meyer Brothers. There are several different flavors of mechanical hammer, some of them based on a rotary face, like you see with a Little Giant. Basically it has a yoke and a spring. There are other ones that and I'm not sure about the terminology here. It is technically, I suppose, I've heard it called a helve hammer, which is essentially a power hammer that uses a teeter-totter style beam. There are still some of them out there. I've seen them function. They work, but they work a lot more like a tilt hammer. And again, it was not the better design. So what you see happening is early in the 1900s, these cast iron mechanical hammers just take over. Just tens of thousands of units going to these little local blacksmith shops. And this was absolutely an incredible advancement for the blacksmith shop, because the limiting factor with a smithy is your arm. To reduce a heavy piece of stock, 2 inches, you need several strong young men and a sledgehammer just to reduce the stock to the size that you need it. Because at that time, now, of course, today you can go to your local steel mill and get sizes in almost any conceivable arrangement. But back in the day, steel usually came to you in one of 3 sizes: small, medium, and oh my God. And you had to have a crew of strikers to be able to reduce it or to shape it into what it was that you needed. But with the advent of the mechanical power hammer, your need for 7 dudes goes away. So it was a huge game changer to how the blacksmith shops worked in that. And remember that the blacksmith shops themselves were transitioning. By 1910, 1920, blacksmith shops were welding shops. And the power hammer was simply, was quickly becoming replaced by the fabricator. So, let me get out of those weeds. So there you have these mechanical hammers. And now, at that same time, you now have a split in the power hammer tree. Because on one side, you have the small, relatively portable mechanical hammer that's going to all of your local blacksmith shops. And then you have what is going to be the evolution of the steam hammer, again being miniaturized. Now, steam is rapidly being replaced with electricity on that end, and whereas certainly there are things that are still being run by steam, there is this huge transition to electric motors and things of that nature. And suddenly, we see steam, which is dangerous and kind of a pain in the butt to generate, being replaced with compressed air. So at this point, now you have the evolution of what we know as the self-contained power hammer. And simply that meant that the problem that we have with utility hammers today, like Big Blue, are the same problem they had back in the day with the steam hammer. It was not a one package deal. You had to have the hammer set up somewhere, and then you had to have this whole other apparatus to generate the power for it, to generate the steam. Same thing today with the utility hammer, except you're just generating compressed air and not necessarily steam. But the self-contained hammer solved all that. So you see, especially in Europe, in England, you see what they call a Chambersburg hammer, and there's several different flavors. There's a German flavor. Kuhn made a lot of hammers, and they still do. Here in the U.S., they had what they called the Nazel hammer, of course, very famous. How in the world can I forget that? But these hammers were usually, as a self-contained hammer, were big hammers. Like a baby Nazel is still going to be 200 pounds on a ram weight. So these are still industrial level hammers that are going into the factories. And one of the reasons they really didn't get down to the blacksmith shop is because those mechanical hammers were so easy to set up, and there was no particular issue with them, and they were small. They were doing all that repair work that was needed. They were encroaching on the work of the smaller town smith. All right, so now that's kind of the way it went until the post-war, and then something very interesting happened. I'm going to take a little bit of a rabbit hole, forgive me, because Germany, those damn Germans, man, they are the ones that really kind of revolutionized heavy forgings. Now, because of World War I, there were some pretty severe restrictions that had been placed on Germany as far as what they could do with iron and steel, because iron and steel were the weapons of war. So they were incredibly limited on what they could do with that material. So the only alternative that they had was going to be aluminum. And the Germans, and man, I would love to talk about this more at length, but let's just say that the Germans were able to come up with a way to actually use these giant hydraulic presses to manufacture aluminum parts to a quality and a degree that nobody else could. Real quick, the fact is that Germany had incredibly well-built aircraft, very sturdy, and the thing is that they, get this, like their Messerschmitts, the way that they were put together, the actual internal framing, were usually one-piece pressings of aluminum. We had to weld everything up. So even though Germany was this relatively small country, their output was staggering because they were actually pressing their aluminum parts and not having to actually mill and weld and forge the parts like we were. Again, I go back to because, I'm a buff on that end of it. The MG42, which is the machine gun 42, which is also the very famous machine gun that they made. Not only were these things horrifyingly fast to shoot, they were cheap to make because they were stamped metal. So it wasn't just iron they were stamping. The real thing they were after was the aluminum. And so they made these monster, like 50,000 ton presses to make these parts. And those presses would then later carry over to ironwork after the war. Completely changed the industry. So let's fast forward a bit, because really the innovation that has come about for blacksmiths has come from blacksmiths in recent memory. So in the 1990s, you had people, I think a lot of this stuff started, and again, the history is not as accessible as you think it would be. But there's a gentleman named Daniel Gentile, out of the Virginias in the mountain area that came up with a hammer he called Rusty. And Rusty was almost a type of not treadle hammer. What's the proper term I'm looking for? It's almost a tilt hammer. It is a seesaw teeter-totter hammer, and it was made using leaf springs and a small motor. And basically you had a teeter-totter with a control arm on one side and a small hammerhead on the other, and the motor would turn and it would drive this spring up and down. So it was kind of a flippy-flappy hammer. And I think there were two versions of this. There was a Rusty that was a smaller hammer, and then there was the Crusty, which was a bigger hammer. Now, and again, there were plans available through Abana, and that's one place where Abana did really, really well. I mean, that was kind of a... that's when I was getting into it. That's the early age of the internet. And man, again, there was a lot of great information going out. But let me not get distracted. So you had the Rusty plans, but about the same time, you had Mr. Clay Spencer. And I don't know if Clay is the one that developed the initial one. I believe that to be the case. But here came the tire hammer. And the tire hammer was the modern replacement for the cast iron mechanical hammer that was so prevalent for so many years. So that tire hammer is kind of now the thing. So now you've got all the players. So now today, what you end up with is you have a couple of different choices for your shop. You have the descendant of the original steam hammer, which is going to be your self-contained hammer. You have the lesser version of that, which is going to be your utility hammer. And then on the mechanical side of things, you're going to have the option of finding one of the old cast iron mechanical hammers, or you're going to have the opportunity to grab a modern tire hammer. And that is those are really going to be your four particular choices. And since I'm already almost 20 minutes into this particular video, I think that's where we'll hold this one up. So there's you a brief history of how we came to the choices that we have today. They are all descended from the steam hammer on that end of it, but they have served very, very different roles and to varying degrees of effectiveness. So the next video that we'll talk about is exactly what the differences in those hammers are, what that means for your particular shop, and all that kind of good stuff. And I just, man, it was hard to talk about the particular hammers without giving you guys just a little bit of the history. So, there's a light walk down memory lane. So good enough, guys. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I will talk to you guys a little bit later.